To hear us well, please select the translation feature, either Ukrainian or English channel. And I think now we may start. I will start the recording now. Hello, dear friends, dear colleague. It's an honor for me to moderate our today's seminar workshop, and I'm honored to introduce you to our presenter, Ms. Oksana Sukhovii. She's a candidate of philological scientist and associate professor of the Ukrainian language department in Taras Shevchenko Kiev National University. Her scope of scientific interest includes Ukrainian dialects, history of Ukrainian language, the historic dialogical phraseology, and lexicography. Today, Ms. Oksana will speak about her work on development of Ukrainian language textbook, a workshop on syntaxes. Please, Ms. Oksana. Thank you. So, dear colleagues from the University of Indiana and our dear Ukrainian my dear Ukrainian colleagues, before I start my presentation, let me say a few words. First of all, I would tell my deepest gratitude to the organizers of this program, Ms. Svetlana and Ms. Sarah. When I applied to this program, I couldn't even imagine how fruitful and multifaceted this cooperation will be. And so if you allow, I will take a few words about these different aspects because it's relevant for everyone. First of all, the project my presentation is dedicated to. Second, its ability to meet you all and gain new rich experience as part of our monthly meetings. The third is our common research and preparation of presentation at the conference. It's Miriam Scheger, Slavic Languages and Literature, Indiana University, who kindly agreed to be my consultant as part of this program. The topic of our common report will be nominative type dialectical dialectical lexic for physical disabilities in the dialects of Ukrainian, Russian, Belarusian, Polish, and Slavic languages, EU Ukrainian and neighboring Slavic languages. So this cooperation, this is already underway. The fourth thing, which is extremely interesting, and I would like to share this experience with you, is my experience of cooperation with the students. Ms. Svetlana teaches Ukrainian language and Russian language at the University of Indiana. I, in Taras Shevchenko Kiev National University, in addition to teaching, I also act as a guarantor.
Мови, переклад та редагування. І в нас виникла ідея організувати серію відеозустрічей між студентами. Це живе спілкування з носіями мови, яку вони вивчають. Мої вивчають англійську, в університеті Індіани вивчають українську. І тому можуть з одного боку підвищити свій рівень.
So on one part, they may improve their own level and better feel what challenges the non-native speakers are facing. So here there is some kind of mirror principle, which is very impressive. We had various practices. One time, each person spoke only their own native language, which is Ukrainian, and in my classes and English in Svetlana's classes other. Then in turn we spoke English and the students at the University of Indiana spoke Ukrainian. And the third time it was everyone used the language he's more comfortable with. It was a very important experience. In addition, we invited Ukrainian students as consultants for all 3 courses of my bachelor programs. So Americans may present on separate topics from the Introduction to Ukrainian Culture course. Ms. Svetlana is teaching or 60 for the group of 60 students, which is a larger, which is a rather large group. There were 15 groups, in which each group would include 5 American and 2 Ukrainian students who prepare reports on various relevant topics, such as the purposes of the communization, decolonization, and denazification in Ukraine, or impact on Ukrainian culture on Russian culture. As you understand, we have 15 such topics. My students help to search for research materials, share some of their own experience, while Americans prepare reports to present together at the end of the semester. And this is very important experience for both our students and for us as for professors. Therefore, this program was immense value and was much wider than it was initially declared. And so I'm very extremely satisfied. And now I will shift the topic and start presenting on my topic. And if you don't mind, I will share my slides. Could you please tell, do you see my slides normally? Yes, yes, okay. Because sometimes we have some technical issues with slides, but it's not our case today. So, the history of Ukrainian language, a workshop on syntaxes. This textbook is a logical continuation of previous publications on the history of the Ukrainian language, historical phonetics and phonology, first edition, and significantly modified and complemented second edition. And the next part, the history of Ukrainian language, historical morphology practicum. As you see, they were created in co-authorship with Professor Halina Nayenko. We worked together at our university department, and we designed this series of workshops, which is the successful implementation of which is currently underway. Currently, Ms. Halina Nayenko is staying in Poland. She's on a business trip as part of the academic mobility program and teaches classes at the University of Lodz. And she currently has her own project. So I am currently, while I am currently focused on this textbook, she will join a bit later, and she very decently presents the Ukrainian linguistic science in the global arena. She has a number of very serious publications in the reputable media, in the reputable journals, and right now she's doing a very important mission. Therefore, only in around 6 months, she will be able to join my work on this textbook. And now I'm going to tell about my own personal work because this is something very difficult things that require a lot of time and very serious scientific research. The textbook is intended to provide the fullest possible representation of modern approaches to solving problematic issues of the origin and development of the syntactic subsystem of the Ukrainian language. As for the structure of this textbook, because all our textbook follows a typical structure, and this typical structure is normally used I normally use to work on this project. Right now I work personally, so Halina Mikhailovna will soon join me. So 3 main structural parts are a workshop, a textbook, and appendices. And as for each part, I will now provide you some more detailed information. The first part is a workshop. It consists of separate topic. There are 6 main topics. These are classical topics for syntaxes, the subject of historical syntaxes, introduction, types of sentences, and then there are more specific topics dedicated to a specific sentence type. Simple 2-part sentences. It's based on how subject and depending on how subject and predicate are used, and it's something closer to contemporary language. While simple compound sentence, we see a lot of various aspects that are not typical for contemporary Ukrainian language. Therefore, this topic requires much more attention. Simple 1-part sentence and compound sentences of various types. I think more many of you remember this concept from your school training, and bilinguists have more in-depth knowledge. But I know understand that our group includes both economists and historians, so I'm trying to use a more easier and more understandable language. So I will take a little bit about the structure of each topic model, because each part consists of 4 models. First of all, this is a reference to the theoretical sources for each topic. I mean, so the bibliography is the reference. Then this is theoretical questions. Then these are practical tasks. And the fourth model is tests for examination. And so while references to theoretical sources and theoretical questions normally follows the typical structure, I will not demonstrate it in this presentation. Then I will now would like speak a little more detail about practice.
So now I'm not going to make you scared of the next slide, so let me return for a while to the first one. So practical tasks are meant to perform different types of work. So it's like comment the articles. Most of those articles will be also presented in this manual in the anthology part. Then reading and analysis of the text, then analysis and explanation of separate language facts. I'm going to show how it happens, and I will use the example of the structure, which will not be very usual for most of you. It is called dative absolute. This is an element of the complex sentence. So this structure, dative absolute, is composed of noun or pronoun together with the participle. So the order may be different, they can change the order, but this structure is used in dative case. There can be also dependent words here. In modern language, we see this structure as the subordinate clause. So first of all, we have here such a junction which says when, then we have a noun or pronoun which will be in the nominative case, and then we will have the past participle and dependent words. So on this example, I want to explain that some syntax structures typical of the written records of old Ukrainian language were ruined and completely substituted by other forms. For example, this dative absolute, it was typical of the old Slavonic written language, of Kiev Rus written language. We can say old Rus language, but under modern approaches, we don't use it. We say Kiev Rus or old Ukrainian language. There are different opinions as to this syntax structure. On the one side, they think it is borrowed from the Greek language, and other scientists think that it is typical Slavonic structure. Sorry for the call, sorry. Thus, in the 16th, 18th centuries, this structure was very rarely seen in text. That's why it's very important to understand the content of the sentences which use such structure. One second, please, I'm sorry. People disturb, sorry. So, such diagrams help us understand and the sentence itself and what happening to it in the modern language. Such diagrams give us visual aid to see in which ways dative absolute is transferred through modern language means. What can we do with this diagram? We see some certain examples. How do we usually work with such structures? For example, древляном же пришедшим повель Ольга, мов створити, Old Rus language. And here we see this dative absolute, which is joined to the main clause, and it is transformed in the modern Ukrainian language in such way. You see the example. So you see how much such structures can be visualized and transferred in a simple way to our language. See the next example. Old Kiev Rus language and old and modern Ukrainian language. As we can see from this diagram, let me return to it. We see the change of grammatical forms here. We indicate different types of primary and secondary structures. And on the next slide, we see on certain examples how we illustrate the means of transferring the structures in with modern language means. So using this one example, I show you how we study the historical syntaxes. You see the structure, you see the diagram, you see the examples. And then we develop different types of tasks using the same method. So, for example, the element of complication of the simple sentence. For example, work with the article of Oksana Nitra, destruction of dativus absolutus in Ukrainian written records of 16th, 18th centuries. This article is contained in the manual, and we are going to work with the scheme how this dative absolute is transferred. It also contained in the third part of the manual. And in the fragments of the text, students are going to find this dative absolutus, explain why it is used here, and transfer it with the means of the modern Ukrainian language. In such ways, students learn the modern approaches to interpretation of some things in the old Ukrainian language. They see how the material can be structured, and they do some independent work with these extracts. Now let's get to the extracts themselves. So our sources are chosen using the new publications of 1990s, 2020s. So they are the most advanced, the recent publications. Thus, we propose to analyze graffiti from the walls of Sensify, abstracts from the Constitution of Philip Orlik, Lutsk Castle Book, written stories of Varlam Yasenyski, recently published judicial acts of Poltava Regimental Court of 1668-1740s, and judicial acts of this court of 1683-1750s. So we mean that we use materials which are given in the modern publications and use the ancient texts. I personally study the written texts of Varlam Yasenyski of the second part of the 17th century, and I plan to use it to the most broadest extent. So this is the book, how it looks like. This is a written record of the second part of the 17th century. It's not in public use,
З нею
and of course, you only specialists can work with it like it is. Some of these stories I have published already, and I'm getting my students acquainted with some separate fragments. I want to show you some of them. Here we use Cyrillic alphabet, and I want to read it. Maybe it will be interesting for you to hear how it sounds and which structures they use. I think here we are not going to explain, yeah, because it's old language.
Тут знову новоє родиться питання. Для чого Господь Бог, ліпячи Адамові з глини тіло, не з такою пильністю учинив йому душу, з якою тіло? Гди прийшло тіло Адамово ліпити, сам, закотивши руки, ніби простий гончар, власними руками назбирав глини чимало, замісив, перетерв, перемяв, протягнув вдовж, заострив, на голову поробив очі, нос, вуха, розтягнув на рамена і на інші її порядне розположив части. Але гди прийшло творити душу, без забави, без великої праці і труду, єдним дмухом вдунув в лице його дихання жизни, і без чоловік в душу живо. Тут поєднується стара українська мова.
These texts combined ancient Ukrainian language with Church Slavic language. If we talk about Bible quotes, and so that's how we may familiarize the students with separate monuments of religious and church sphere. Also, you see the Ukrainian, this is actually real Ukrainian language. Oh, I will show you another fragment because this quadrant and it's very interesting.
В Ляцидемонії молодим людям заказували вина пити, а то для певних причин, називаючи вино огнем, і мовили: не прикладай огня к огню. Чому то вино називали огнем? З многих мір. Нічого тоє же чоловіка розпалить, буде блідий, як турунська цегла, зардіється, як буряк. Але тоже п'яний не вміє заховати секрету, вже його на собі самому виявляє. Доводом того, он і сильний богатир Самсон, котрий поти був сильний і дужий, поки його Далила вином не подпоїла, а як скоро ся вина напив, секрету не заховав і виявив, за чим сили очі і живота себе позбавив. Прето ж, яко огонь доказує, много показує і вино. Огонь секрета виявляє і вино. Ось із такими фрагментами.
So these are the fragments we work with, and using such texts, in this text we can clearly identify the syntaxes of the late Baroque period. So some fragments are useful material for syntactic analysis of both simple compound and various types of complex sentences. Each, the study of which topics ends with a fourth test module. The tests have the following structure. They either are of theoretical nature, like these questions. As you see, I selected this construct of dative independent clause in order to better clearly and demonstrate it more clearly. For example, how the structure has changed in contemporary Ukrainian language, and just a various multiple answer question. Or we provide a sentence or fragment of the sentence and ask what syntactic construction is used in this sentence. In this case, this is the secondary predicate. I'm sorry, this is some problem with the font. It's much like my little mistake. So as you see, we may provide the fragments of various texts. So students should answer the question. Students should answer the question. So we discussed it in the following way, as to analyze each sentence. So it's not mechanical task. For example, you just select option A or B or C, but you have to explain why you select this particular answer and why this particular answer is incorrect and why this particular answer is correct. And so we select that word, that option B is indeed the complex subject. Tests for each topic, as you understand, are added in order to ensure that the students have indeed mastered the theoretical foundations and they are of a training nature. Next. So this is the first part of and the second part is the textbook, if we call it in a simple way, or it's called training materials for studying historical syntaxes of the Ukrainian language. This is the name exactly from the book. Here, it includes separate articles or fragments of articles by reputable Ukrainian linguists dedicated to the historical syntaxes in order to achieve proper level of academic evidence when teaching this discipline. Also, recently we are lacking the really fundamental scientific monographs. However, there are pretty in-depth scientific research on some matter. For example, this book will include, or rather has already included, an article by Shevchuk, Structural and Syntematic Interaction of Imperative Units in Complex Sentences of the Old Ukrainian Language. As you see, this article was released in 2005, so all articles are pretty contemporary. This article is a part of her PhD thesis, Formal Grammatical and Functional Semantic Stratification of Imperative Construction in the Ukrainian Language of the 16th, 18th century. Maybe it sounds a little bit difficult, but still, what's interesting here? Using these articles, the students may see what complex imperative constructions are used to express various, or better to say diverse imperatives. For example, it can be an order, it may be a call, it may be a wish, a recommendation, an advice, etc. So you see it on the next two slides, and then you see it may be a will, a prohibition, an offer, a request, a prayer, an invitation. And for each of these units, we see a large and illustrative materials. And these illustrative materials also will be used in the practical part of the book. So the tasks will use this kind of various contexts. You see there are a lot of various tasks collected in one single fragment. The manual will always include the provision of several dissertation researches, for example, by Mikhailo Kovalchuk, complex sentences with undifferentiated types of communication in the old Ukrainian language, or by Oksana Zelinska, research on appeals in Baroque ceremonies, or by Marina Kapas. By the way, Marina Kapas was a master's department student at our department when she applied with this article, and actually one of her tasks was to show the evolution of a scientist, to represent the Kiev Linguistic School, because Marina was a student of our professor Oksana Ivanovna Nita, and Oksana Ivanovna research is focused on research of history of Ukrainian language, and her master students wrote this article, which I include in my book, in order to demonstrate this process of scientific evolution. Of course, currently Marina is a candidate of science. So there will be this will also include an article by Moskolenko, prepositional constructions in the Act Book of Poltava Regimental Code of the second half of the 17th century, early 18th century, and number of others. We have a preliminary agreement with Andriy Danilenko, a Ukrainian American philologist, full professor of modern contemporary languages and cultures at Pace University in New York, to translate and publish in the textbook a fragment of his article on the peculiarities of emergence and information of complex sentences in Ukrainian language, on the relativization strategies in East Slavic. He advocates the idea that complex sentences evolved from compound sentences. I will be translating this article myself. And of course, he will edit and approve it to make sure that all terms and all ideas are translated correctly. Because during translation, I have translated one article from Russian. It was much easier in the phonetics and phonology textbook. But of course, it was much simpler because Russian language is much closer than English to Ukrainian. And it's absolutely a normal approach when author has to edit and approve the translation. Next, I will also show you a fragment from an article by Yevhen Tevchenko, vocative in Ukrainian language. I added a date here, which is 1926, for a reason, because initially I mentioned the textbook would include will include the articles and fragments of articles published recently, published during the last 40 years, and now we see 1926. So why so? Because Yevhen Tevchenko, his works were prohibited during Soviet age, and there was no access to his scientific publications, his papers. And of course, right now, his works are not that accessible. So some fragments which are highly relevant, including this particular article as an exception, it will be included into this textbook along with other materials. So vocative. Let's first of all, I think that it will be interesting for students to talk about Ukrainian language of the 20th century, which is quite unusual for contemporary linguistics. We see this word. We combine the vocative in three functions of nominatives: the subject, opposition, and apposition and predicative attribute, and a function of the subject. And so what is especially interesting about this fragment? Please pay attention. In the illustrations, Yevhen Timchenko refers to the sources of mostly dating back to 19th century. So we may see how I highlighted these particular words in bold. So we can see the forms of vocative in the function of nominative. So just take a look. It's just a part of these examples which date back to 19th century, and they were actively used during this historic age. So I think these things should be represented because also part of history of our syntaxes. So this construction, it's mostly because I remember when I was a student.
I remember that it was typical in the written records of the Russian language. So, for example, in the stories of old times, we can see these examples of vocative. So we see that they used vocative case there. So we thought that such structures were quite ancient. And we see that they were still used in the 19th century and even in the Ukrainian literature. So the third part of the manual are the annexes. We will have their tables, diagrams, pages from written records, examples of some tests, the list of questions to the tests, the dictionary of terms, and the recommended literature. There are a lot of structural elements here, but I want to pay some attention to some of them. If we talk about the dictionary of terms, I'm going to show you some example. So the dictionary will have the terms which are relevant for the historical syntaxes. There are no definitions for subject, simple sentence, which are characteristic of the syntaxes of the modern language, but we explain here the terms of double cases, for instance, double nominative, double genitive, double accusative, or such notion as ablative predicative, which we can find in the written records of old Ukrainian language. Dictionary entries will be illustrated with the examples, and you can see one of such entries. So here we are talking about absolute dative. We show its Latin translation, explain this notion, and give some examples from the old texts. So here we will have a lot of different tables. I showed you one of the table also on the example of this dative absolute, but I would like to show you, dear colleagues, my personal tables, which will be included, which were included to some of the previous publications, and I want to see how I develop those tables. They do not refer to syntaxes, but they might be interesting for you. For example, if you think about, if you know about the first transfer palatalization of consonants, so here I give the examples of the words where we can see this phenomena. Then I show here such a phenomenon through the formulas. And after that, I give the full comment where I indicate the position in which this phenomenon takes place with the examples of Old Slavonic language, of some transitional stage examples, and the examples of the old Ukrainian written language. And I also show the chronology here. Another example will be more clear for you, because we all know about different types of simplifications in the language. And here I show much more than we learn at school. We don't teach them much. And even in the textbooks on the history of the language, they don't show much of such examples. So here I try to take it to the maximum and to show some examples how it happens. Or there are such tables which refer to the origin of the vowels and for all the consonants, phonemes in Ukrainian language. Maybe I have missed something. We are all imperfect, but I was doing my best to take into consideration all types, all possible versions of origin of the vowels and consonant phonemes. So here I show where they could have possibly originated from. And here the structures of Old Slavonic or maybe some borrowed languages, like here from Greek. And I do it for all the vowels. I will show you also two tables for morphology. For example, in this case, we see such a table which unites some simple forms of verb and some complex forms. Such a table simplifies the understanding of simple and complex forms, and from 4 simple forms, how they are transferred into 4 complex forms. and the students really need such things. I can tell it from my practice. I will show you one more table. It takes 2 slides. So this is like restructuring of the old Ukrainian language forms into the modern language. So these are the forms which existed. The example, here I'm talking from the first person. Then what happens to this form? If it has several special features, I also indicate them here. And in such way, we get acquainted with the origin and the way these modern forms appeared. And here is the continuation of this table. So this is the past tense form. It's a bit more complicated, but I also hope it will be clear. Maybe it's interesting for some of you. And if we return to syntaxes, we will also have different tables. Some of them are ready. Diagrams, they will cover different types of sentences, of complications, so everything will be visualized. At this point, yeah, my presentation disappeared, right? Yeah, at this point, I would like to thank you all for attention and waiting for your questions. Maybe you will be more interested in some details or additional explanations. Thank you for your attention.
Thanks a lot,
Miss
Miss
Oksana.
Oksana, for your interesting report. I just recalled how I was a student at the University of Taras Shevchenko University, and I was studying all these language constructions, and you presented in very interesting way. I think it's very important not only for contemporary Ukrainian language professors, but also for those who teach Ukrainian as a foreign language, because also we sometimes have to explain various grammatic forms to the students, and I think it's very important to know their origins. As dear colleagues, before you have ask any questions, when I normally talk my students about Ukrainian verbs, I compare our perfect with perfect forms in English language, how they're built, how they're structured. Yes, it's wonderful. Thanks a lot, Miss Oksana. And we have our first question from Miss Maria. Miss Oksana, I'm extremely grateful to the organizers because today we celebrate the International Native Language Mother Language Day. And it's so nice that today we have both presentations dedicated to Ukrainian language. But I have the following questions. From my experience, because all of us were teaching historical syntaxes, historical grammar, and only those who passed these exams with a good grade considered good. However, I'm, as a person who studies literature, I would like to recall one event during the independence in Ukraine in St. Petersburg. One of our colleagues the colleagues from St. Petersburg did some presentation, and there was a following fragment. A boy speaks Ukrainian language and addresses his grandmother. And the next letter by Russian writer also uses a similar syntax. And we recognize this vocative form, which does not exist in the Russian language, was used in the Russian literature, as you mentioned, Timchenko. This is a very important aspect. This is... I'm sorry, is it just me experience problem, or yes, we haven't heard what you said. Could you please repeat? I'm sorry. I just want to say that even if the writers felt what this vocative form, this is a perfect indication of these fundamental differences between two languages. This is extremely important. I express my greatest gratitude and wish you all success, and thank you for your presentation today and a lot of materials, for example, Olgin and toponymics, Olgin, Olgin in Mykolaiv region. We see this Sovietization of toponyms, and all Ukrainian national national language basis was changed to the more Russian, more Russian. And also I want to mention a few words about the vocative. In Russian language there is vocative. However, 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 it's used mostly in a church language, like in the prayers. However, Miss Maria, what I paid attention at, you say vocative form. Yes, we once studied vocative form at schools because there was no other clauses. All clauses were similar in Russian and Ukrainian language. And so some kind of vocative form in Ukrainian. And now we still talk about, we call it correctly, vocative clause. Thank you. Thanks a lot for your wonderful feedback. Yes, please, Miss Nadia. Thank you. I would like to express my appreciation to Ms. Oksana for its extremely interesting report. And I would like to ask the following question. For us, can share some feedback. Famous Ukrainian historian Talia Kovenko in 2014 released a wonderful book called Search for a New Sky, The Fate and Text by Nick Halitovsky, and she, as a historian, she reviews these texts from the historical perspective, historical anthropology perspective, and this, the worldview of the 17th century person, names of these sayings and his preachers. So I'm curious how your review of 17th century texts from linguistic point of view, how it actually overlaps the historical review, historical research such as Halatovsky, and what are potential differences between linguistic and historical perspective at which where you linguists pay more attention on, maybe historian miss some details due to the limited set of the historical instruments of the toolkit. Actually, as we closely interact with historians, maybe you know the monography on paleography by Sakirko. I don't remember the exact name, but we had a lot of discussions about perception of linguistic facts by historians and perception of historical facts by linguists. And of course, we attempt to cooperate in order to avoid any major differences in interpretation, in perception. And if we talk about some particular age, because 70s and 17th century is a late Baroque age, we should take into account the specifics of cultural age, and this also affects the language. In particular, this combination of various language types, some where old Ukrainian language prevail, and so of more spoken type, and somewhere it's more book type language. And sometimes these fragments may combine and intertwine with each other. And of course, we attempt to add some comments, add some notes to explain the existence of both these types. We can't say that this is only spoken Ukrainian language. There are some fragments, there are some additions of Polish language. And when my study of Varlam Yasinski's Cauldrons, I see this very strong, very powerful stream of Polish language. Because, for example, when we take a look at the text, almost in each line, we may witness some overlaps, which is very specific for this age. And of course, historical events overlap with the language. Why this particular language was used during this particular age, what prevails. So, of course, we take into account the historical events, the historical comments, and historical comment is mandatory. Linguistics cannot exist without history. History of language cannot exist without the history of nation. Both similar and so the history of literature, the history of culture. All these components are intertwined with each other. And also, I would like to ask another question, if you don't mind, if there are no other questions. When Natalia Yakovenko explained her interest in Halatovsky in particular, she mentioned that even previously in 18th century, when his researches were published, she read this text and she was thinking that this is about the closeness of this text to Ukrainian language, the similarity. And later, using her based on her scientific and research career, she made this kind of conclusions. And also, she has an interesting idea that unless repression during the second part of 18th century, in particular of Kiev Mogila Academy, unless suppression of this tradition, then maybe we would use this tradition of Halatovsky as a founder. We would consider Halatovsky as a founder of Ukrainian language. Halatovsky, not Kotlarevsky. About similarities about the 18th century, it's very interesting topic and very deep, and then there's a very interesting deep ancient tradition. This is a source of treasure, and of course we share everything with students, not just the written, not just the ancient legacy, but also the works of literature in various genres. Thanks a lot. Thank you, dear colleagues. Are there any questions? If not, I have some questions for Ms. Oksana. Maybe I will mention a few questions and she will select the one she wants to respond the most. Okay, I will write it down in order not to miss them. Okay. Well, my first question is of more general nature. When now speak about the colonization of Ukraine, for some systemic is very relevant, for some is very controversial. Is in the context of the history of Ukrainian language. What are the most important problems do we face here? And can we talk about the colonization of the history of Ukrainian language? Okay, so the biggest problem is that representative of Russian linguistic school misappropriate this term of Rus language, ancient Russian language. And so this is, they consider Russian language as like as a continuation of ancient Rus language. This is very important for Ukrainian researchers, for linguists. However, it's not obvious for the whole world. For us, so the Russians don't understand at all what it has to do with Ukraine, and I don't know what's going on currently in USA, but in Europe, this predecessor of Ukrainian language, of contemporary Russian language, what does this word ancient Russian term means? It's a very contradictional matter, and it's very hard to liberate from this chauvinism of this group. This Russian chauvinism is very difficult. They have misappropriated all the legacy of the literature legacy. Sometimes people get really surprised. What do you mean, old Ukrainian? This is ancient Russian. And it's very hard to fight this. We have to fight it, and we are trying to do it. That's why we publish articles in reputable sources, global sources. We advocate Ukrainian language. So this is something, this is a matter of top priority. And I hope to witness this breakdown point very soon. And the next question is about the use of active uh, of active participle, because some of our linguist philologists advise to avoid using this participle. So I would like to ask you as a professional, how often you notice these participles in authentic Ukrainian texts, and should we really avoid them? For example, And what is your attitude in this regard? So I understand your question, and if it talks history of this active participle, active present participle, of course, it developed back in ancient times, and it slowly developed. The key tendencies, we believe, in particular Kiev Linguistic School, and me as a representative of this university, we believe this participle has not preserved in the contemporary language. So what happened to it? Well, there are less common concepts to consider these words as a participle, first of all, because, well, because it turns into the attribute. For example, we have this formal suffix, but it's transformed into the attribute. It can transform into the attribute with operand the different suffixes. And the third point, it may be transformed into nominatives. So it's absolute, and it sounds absolutely natural in Ukrainian language. It may transform into a noun, so subjunctive, so it now answers the question who. It used as a noun. And of course, this is a known process when this participle transforms into other forms of speech. Actually, this developed as this form. It was a form of nominative clause of male nominative clause. Ідучий, the one who walks, and basically this participle fixed this female form. Therefore, our primary attitude and our key position is that we don't consider these words to be participles anymore. However, in some articles, they are still researched as participles. However, the research evolves, the science evolves at the level of research and universities, and I think we may also ask this question to Larissa Kisuk, because I represent the faculty and she represents the academic community. Thanks a lot, Ms. Oksana. So we should now consider these words as attributes that developed historically from active participle. Yes, but what's the specifics here? For example, the participle, we may use it. It may be used to form the teronomous clause. However, these words cannot be used this way. It doesn't sound naturally. It doesn't sound natural in Ukrainian language.
So it doesn't sound natural when it forms a construction. So I think our first part is coming to its end. It was a very interesting presentation. Thank you for such lively discussion of it. And we have one more presentation today. I forgot